If there's one weird thing about the 1990s in Canadian politics, it's probably that the main Conservative Party for 130 years was now irrelevant. The Progressive Conservatives, and before that the Conservative Party, were dying out, and they were being replaced with the Reform Party. Now, they died out in 2000 and were replaced with the Alliance Party, who merged with the Conservatives in 2003. But now, more than ever in the past 21 years, have the Reform Party and the Alliance Party mattered the most. The Reform Party came to life in the 1980s, technically, although they weren't really a force until the 1990s, and this is because of Brian Mulroney. If you want more in-depth on why the Reform Party started and with the whole Brian Mulroney, you can check someone else. All I want to say here is Meech Lake Accord. This was disastrous for everyone in the country, right? So Quebec, because of patriation in 1982, Quebec was not on board with it. They did not agree with it. So Mulroney was like, yo, vote me in and I will make it good. And Quebec was like, okay, yeah, I'll vote you in. So they did. They voted in Brian Mulroney, and now he does this Meech Lake Accord to try and get Quebec on terms with the Constitution and make them happy with it. However, it fails. And now this is bad for Quebec, right? Because they didn't get what they wanted. They're now mad at Brian Mulroney because he didn't get what he wanted done. And it's also bad for people in the West, especially. Since Mulroney spent so much time on the Meech Lake Accord, it made them feel like he was focusing way too much on Quebec and Eastern Canada, which has really always been a problem. See, most of Canada's population lives in the east of Canada. I'm sure you've seen that line where 50% of the population lives below. It's probably more than 50, but whatever. It's a big problem for people in the West who don't get really any much attention, and that's unfortunate, of course. So people in the West, especially back then in the 1990s, felt left out by the federal government. And they decided that they were being too alienated, and they went on to start the Reform Party. And it was evident really early on, I should say instead, that Reform was a success. They had surged to 50, or was it 50? I think it was 52 seats in the House in the 1993 election, much to the dismay of the Progressive Conservatives, who only won 2 seats. That's right, in the entire House of Commons, the Progressive Conservatives won 2 seats, and Reform got 52. Well, they were running candidates as east as... I know they ran candidates here in Ontario, but I don't know if they ran anywhere east. Please correct me if I'm wrong. Most of their seats, if not... No, I'm pretty sure all of their seats were west of Winnipeg, and that was a big problem, because Reform can't get into government, because they don't get any support east of Ontario. Bloc Québécois, who was official opposition after the 93 election, obviously couldn't get into government. The NDP had fallen so far below, they can't get into government. And the Progressive Conservatives, without help of Reform, and Reform without help of the Progressive Conservatives, couldn't get into government either. It was the Liberals who got into power for 1993 to 2006, because they were a big player and they were the only party who really could get any seats. Jean Chrétien got a majority all 3 times. Paul Martin did lose the majority, although he still won a minority. But back to the Reform Party. They sprang up, and they're doing well. They do even better in the 1997 election, going up to, I think, 60 seats and official opposition. Reform Party is on top of the world now. But in 2000, they're not Reform anymore. They're the Alliance Party, where they still retain official opposition, but they are... they're becoming less popular, and that's a big problem. They are getting most of the supports from the Progressive Conservatives, but a lot of people are inching away from Reform and more to Liberals, because they view Reform as alienation, separatist, conspiracy theorists, right? So they're not really voting for Reform. And by the time of 2003, the Alliance Party and the Progressive Conservative Party merged to become the Conservative Party. And that was it. Alliance faded, Reform faded. No one really actually cared about these two parties forever, I guess, until really now. And it's a big problem now. People are now talking about Western alienation more than they have in the past 20 years, I'd argue. And it's because a lot of something to do with Danielle Smith, who I personally don't hold a very high position of. Like, I really don't think she's a great politician. I think she's probably borderline traitor. But anyways, she is trying to get Alberta to separate, and there's likely going to be an independence vote as early as next year. And that is horrendous and scary to think about for anyone in the East. But come on, they have a point. Not the separation part. That is completely not okay. But what is okay is to feel like they're being alienated, because in a sense, they are. When you think of Western Canada, what do you think of? Do you think of how great the landscape is? Probably not. You probably think of their idiotic premiers. And that's not really a good thing. Maybe you think of oil and gas or natural resources. Again, you probably should have been thinking about the things that make them great and not the things that make them bad. It's really not good how the media here in Eastern Canada refuses to show how good Western Canada is. And that makes Western Canada feel isolated and alienated from the rest of the country. So over the next 4 years, Mark Carney's got to be careful. Mark Carney has got to make sure he's doing the right thing for Western Canada, because who knows when there can be the next Reform Party. Although I think if there is a party calling for separation in the west of Canada, it probably will be restricted to the province of Alberta. I will not be surprised at all if the next independence vote, likely next year, fails, and then there's this new party that springs up called maybe, I don't know, like the Alberta Independence Party or the Alberta First Party or something along those lines, comes up and gets a lot of seats. I would not be surprised, because they feel alienated, and that's a problem. It's not really something that's fake news, right? It's real. They feel alienated. They're just really shouldn't be trying to separate from the country. That's a big problem. The ideals of reform were clear. They felt that Ottawa was not treating them right, and they thought that, you know what, we gotta show them in Ottawa what is right and what needs to happen here in the western part of Canada. And I totally see that happening. I honestly think that reform is more powerful now, is more thought of, and is more influential today than it has been in the last 20 years. Because of Danielle Smith and Alberta talking about all this separation and Western alienation, which is a huge problem. We need to fix this. Right? This should be on the top of our priority list to get settled. We need to get Alberta back in line, and we need to have a united country, especially with these threats that we've been having down south. Right? This is not a joke. This is serious. And we honestly, seriously, have to do more to keep Alberta in line and keep them a part of Canada, which is humongous. But also, if you think about it, they can't really separate anyways, right? Because there's really nothing they can do. They rely on us. And as a patriot, I would really hate to see Alberta leave. Because, sure, they have a weird premier. But Alberta's a beautiful province, right? And I would hate to see them just leave out of nowhere, right? So reform is more useful now, because a lot of people in the West are thinking about alienation and separation. So thank you guys for watching. Hopefully this is the last video I have to make on this subject, because I really hope that we don't have to talk about Western separation anymore.